Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. I have got a fascinating guest for you, Martin Gonzalez. And Martin, he and his colleague work on Google for Startup Accelerator. I've always been very impressed by the work that Google does, but they've written a fabulous book called The Bonfire Moment. And we've just really struck it off, almost like one of those early friendships that you make with somebody, because there's so much that you get from each other, and there's generosity in his spirit, and we just bounced off each other. But without further ado, welcome, Martin. It's great having you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Jonathan.
Yeah, well, it's really great, and well done on the book. As you know, I've just I downloaded the Bonfire Moment and started listening to it 2 days ago, and I'm 90% of the way through it. I've thoroughly
Impressive.
enjoyed it and recommend it to the listeners in 135 countries around the world who are listening. It's really useful if you are certainly, obviously, with Google helping the startup accelerator, startup companies, and your co-founders or CEOs or people getting entrepreneurial businesses going. I think it's pretty good for most leaders, actually, even CEOs that I know who are well established in big companies who've been around for up to 100 years. There's some of the lessons in there that they can learn from. Um, let's talk about leaders like these. I'm always interested, Martin, in who you find to be an inspiring leader. Do you want to shout out for a couple of people and what qualities?
Yeah.
A few in your book, but what qualities about people that you admire? Choose a
You know,
couple.
the first one that really comes to mind is Laszlo Bach. And Laszlo was the man who set up people operations at Google. He and I share a similar background. So before coming to Google, he was actually a strategy consultant at McKinsey. Before I came to Google, I was also a strategy consultant at the Boston Consulting Group. And he approached the work of people with so much fresh, like a beginner's mindset, such a curiosity. Um, and as a result, in his tenure of so many years of doing this, he has done remarkable things to the field, not just for Google, but really for the world, the whole practice of, of HR, as you will. Um, he basically brought to the world what we now call as people analytics. And the spirit behind this was, can we bring data and science to every people related decision? And the brilliance and the simplicity of that has really inspired me, and that was the reason why I actually left my strategy job at BCG and joined Google. He leaves Google maybe about 6 or 12 months after I joined, and
No.
we've kept in touch, and he actually has been so kind to blurb the book. But he's been quite an inspiration because he's not content with status quo, and he's so mission oriented. It's so, like, my time under his leadership was always about, we're going to do this for Google, but really also for the world.
Right.
And there was this big ethos around, let's just share it for free. Like, many companies who look at their culture as their secret sauce would never talk about this for free externally. But that was the ethos. And in many ways, it was very much the Google ethos, where you can, search was free and YouTube is free and everything. And there's this idea of, a rising tide lifts all ships. And I quite like that. And I've modeled in many ways my approach, to helping others, and, and leading my own teams, and writing this book after his inspiration.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds really great. And in fact, that's a nice time to talk about you and, whiz us quickly, if you would, through your upbringing. And then we're going to have a bullshit circle moment, you and I,
Okay.
when you
Yeah.
do after that.
Yeah.
But just give us, without circle bit for now, just give us a little bit. I mean, you were in BCG for 3 years now. You've been in Google.
Yeah.
But you originally came from the Philippines. So just tell us a bit about who
Yeah.
your parents, that kind of stuff, as the
Yeah.
leader you are today.
So I grew up. I was born and grew up in the Philippines. I studied there and started my career there as a product manager for an American company, Johnson and Johnson. I come from a line of avid learners. My grandfather, who passed away, just a few years ago, he passed away at 107 years old.
Wow.
At 90 years old, he realizes after having put all his kids through school, and many of them had gone abroad. My father, went did his MBA at Harvard. Like he thought, maybe it's my turn to go back to school. And he was a lawyer all throughout his career. And at age 90, he signs up for or 89, I think, he signs up for a master's in law degree. And when he does this, as grandkids, we're like, Lolo, which is our affectionate word for grandpa, like, what, like, you don't need to do this. What? But this was him, and he really, at the heart of him, believed that education was the great equalizer. He comes from a very humble beginning. So that's kind of a very influential force in my life. And
Yeah.
my grandma was a writer. She also was a teacher. um and I had a chance after 4 years of being a product manager at J&J to go back to school. And again, because of this real ethos of we study and we elevate ourselves through education, the natural path was to do an MBA. And I thought to myself, and I was very rebellious. I was a second child, behind an older brother, so I always wanted to differentiate from him. And so I thought, what could be more boring than an MBA? And all through this time, I was actually very active leading organizations in school and a faith-based youth group. And at some point, I was like a leader and an advisor to this org that would have 400, 500 kids. And on the side, the one thing I loved about that work was I would pick up these leadership books, Jonathan. I'd read them, and then I'd create a workshop over the weekend. And like, who knows if any of that was actually robust or useful? But I just loved it, and this was just my own. Like, I knew I loved it so much that I would be up until 4 a.m. just like writing out the slides, writing out kind of the workshop guides. And I was doing this kind of while I was starting my career as a product manager, like having the real job. My side hustle was I would take vacation leaves and run these workshops for companies. And so at some point I thought, okay, if I have a chance to go back to school, and you only live once, like, what if I just do something that's not the usual path, and study organizational psychology. Back in the Philippines, there wasn't a very clear path on how I would turn that into a profession. So I took the risk. I went to school. I studied organizational psychology at Columbia University in New York, and I fell in love. I loved it so much that at the end of my program, I told myself, I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back. And so I end up doing a bit of a career detour, and we can go into more detail later on. But I instead of going into leadership development or consulting to leaders, I go into strategy consulting. And in the process of realizing that I wasn't a particularly excellent strategy consultant, I said, look, I need to come back to the original plan, which is to go and do work with leaders and organizational issues. And so I make my way into the people and organization practice within the Boston Consulting Group, and then started to do some really fun work in that space. And right around that time, kind of Google comes into the picture. And so I joined Google 10 years ago now. It's been quite the ride. Part of what I like talking about is how I've somehow become like a serial immigrant. In the course of my career, 15 years ago, leaving the Philippines, lived in New York, and then Indonesia and Jakarta, and then went to Singapore, then to Taiwan, and now in the US for the past 4 years, all with kids in tow, which complicates it for
How
sure.
many kids have you got, Martin?
Three kids. Three
Three kids.
kids.
What sort of ages?
So they're 8, 10, and 11. And they're at an age where I've had to make promises around staying put and, building, growing roots and building friendships. So yeah.
Well, look, congratulations on your family. No, that's very special.
Thank you.
And thank you for also sharing about, the life journey and what's shaped you. No doubt about it that you've pushed yourself to do some some big things, some big brands like Boston Consulting Group, and going to Columbia to do the MA in psychology. Johnson Johnson, a great brand. So it's always this striving to do well, and obviously there's high expectations of you. But one of the things in the book, and we'll talk more about the book in a moment, but you talk about a very powerful bit, is the bullshit circle. And I like the way that you did it. You said that, look, in startups, a lot of the time people are trying to pump themselves up, and they've polished and shined their CV, that actually it resembles very little of what they've actually done, but they start to believe their own hype. And of course, you've gone to the land of hype in America, where everything is, oh, great, wow, it's the best, you're the best, like, wow, okay, so everybody's first, no one can be anything else. It's fantastic, amazing. Of course, in Britain, we're all sort of a dour.
That's right. Yeah,
really bad.
Says the Brit, right? Yeah,
such a loser. I don't know what I'm going to do. But there's this lovely part, and it's in chapter 10, where you both begin to share, as you get people to do in this very powerful workshop that you do, the Bonfire Moment. The Bonfire Moment is where part of it, where you're sharing the fears and the insecurities that you have, and you're dropping the bullshit. So I'd love you here live with me to share yours, and then I will mirror by, I haven't prepared for this, so I don't know what's going to come out, by sharing my bullshit moment. So you go first, and just show how it's done.
Yeah, and maybe for the listeners, if you can imagine, the way we run this workshop is we bring out bean bags, and we have a virtual bonfire playing. So we have laptops, and a bonfire video playing, and we try to invite founders to really reflect on not just what their insecurities are, but also the masks that they therefore wear to cover up. So and we share this story in the book, and I'd be happy to share it with you, Jonathan, with your listeners. A big part of my story of growing up in the Philippines, the Philippines had been colonized by Spain for a very long time, by the Japanese for a shorter time, and in America. And there was a very big cultural kind of influence that America had over the Philippines. Many of us speak English, and that's one very clear a clear manifestation of this. But then more subtly, growing up in the Philippines, there was this real sense that anything that came from America was already immediately better or excellent. And and I had a few moments where this became really true, where when you sell work in an elite consulting firm, like you need that white guy in the case team for you to close that big deal. Like you can't all be just from that region. And that somehow weighed so heavily on me, as in good and bad ways. Like many of us want to come to the US, dream of building a life in the US. And when I finally make my way out of the US for grad school, wow, the imposter syndrome hits, the insecurity hits really hard. I remember coming to Columbia for the first time, and then meeting a lot of my colleagues, and somehow in particular, my colleagues who were white men, who I guess would see as real peers. They were so much more eloquent. They were able to express their ideas so much more immediately. And I always thought my accent was clumsy, uncultured. Part of this also was I had grown up to have to learn multiple languages. I have Filipino, my local language. English is my primary language. I first worked in a rural part of the Philippines. I had to learn 2 of those dialects to be effective in that job. And so I really struggled to kind of stick to one language in these environments. And I always felt, less than. Early on, I told myself, something I share in the book, and I get goosebumps every time I share this. I even seriously thought about what would it look like if I went to an acting school that could teach me how to speak like an American, because by doing that, I could possibly level with them and sound as intelligent as them. And it's ironic to me that I speak to a Brit who, I think Americans look to Brits as like, oh, this is the accent of, even the higher class. but kind of in this hierarchy of culture and sophistication and intelligence, I find myself at the bottom of this. And I tell myself early on that if there was another person who is, who has the same goals as I am, but is not of my skin color, they will succeed. If we put in the same amount of effort, the same goals, they will get there first. And very early on, I told myself, well, what can I control? Well, I can control my work ethic. And so I committed myself to working doubly, triply hard than my peers. Um, and constantly thought of ways to differentiate myself. And somehow that has become a big part of, I work a lot with their executives at Google. I've also written a book kind of in the wee hours of the morning. I wake up at 4 a.m. to write the book until 6:30. Then I wake up the kids to get to school. And this work ethic, when people kind of talk about the 4-day work week or having longer weekends, I always tell myself, look, this is not for you, Martin. Like, it would be good, it would be wonderful, but this is not for you. And somehow through the course of my work, as I've run these, as I've helped leaders across the world, I would catch myself in very visceral ways. Like I found myself in my early 30s scanning the room, and if there was a white man in the room, I would almost get this subconscious kind of, I would feel myself clam up and get really anxious. And I've had to really overcome that over time and realize, and I want to say this with a lot of care and concern, because I know that this topic of race is such a, it's such a loaded topic, and it's so clear to me, Jonathan, that you are a white man and you've been such a kind person, and I've realized, and my co-author is a white man, and I've realized that so much of society, there are privileges that are afforded to some people and not to others. I myself have my own sources of privilege. Being a man is itself being, is a source of privilege where I come from. But I've also learned that we're all also overcome by our own self-doubts and insecurities, and wondering if we're worth anything in this world. And so I find a lot of solace, and I've found a lot of healing of those, really, that a lot of that cultural baggage, through friendships like I have with yours and with my co-founder Josh. And it's been, that's my that's the story of my of the bullshit that I have learned to put out into the world because of these insecurities.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, very powerful in what you've shared. And how have you come to terms with it so that you show up in the amazing way you do now, very authentically, and as a peer of mine, where actually I'm looking at you and going, wow, I wish I could be like Martin. So how have you come to terms with it in a way that's healthy for you?
It's a good one, and I'd like to say I'm not sure that I've fully overcome it. I've also learned to realize that maybe I need to embrace some of these narratives that are hard to shed off. But I think so. The race topic, especially in America, is such a charged topic, and I think what a lot of people, what happens in these really heated conversations is there's a lot of depersonalizing of the other. There's this us versus them, and we have needs and hurts and wants, but they are oppressive, and they are kind of this, almost this non-human figure of power. And I think what has really helped me is building these friendships, and also just speaking very, very candidly and authentically about my inner life, and then hearing about other people's inner lives, and then realizing that there's so much we can connect on, and then also realizing that, look, this chip in my shoulder that I had to grow up with, that has forced me to hustle harder. And I was telling one of my amazing managers, Gina Peluca, who really cared so much, so deeply about this facet of my upbringing. I told her what she said, I want to change the world around you, Martin. So you can feel like you can succeed. And something I told her was, Gina, I'm not sure I actually necessarily want that for myself, because there's something about, and look, maybe we talk 10 years from now, Jonathan, and I'll tell you something different, but in some ways that has become a big part of my identity. And it's been a big part of why I've also been helpful to many other people around the world. Like, if I didn't have this push to want to do something meaningful on the world stage, I probably wouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Yeah.
Well,
What do you think? I don't
let's
know.
reflect. No, it is very interesting, and I found time and again, and this is some 323 guests, and I think you're number 323. Everybody has their origin story, and everybody has either things that give them confidence or things they feel deeply insecure about, and they want to prove wrong. And I'm going to tell my bullshit circle story in a moment. And I think the people who are most comfortable with an easy life and nothing really unusual, no feelings of inadequacy or no over anxious overachievers, then they just do okay, but they never really achieve something phenomenal. The extraordinary results come from ordinary people who are feeling they need to prove something to somebody.
Yeah.
So in some ways, when everything's okay, it doesn't really make us strive. We need to be dysfunctional in
Yeah.
some way to have driven us. So my origin story and my to pay the compliment back to you is that, I grew up, and at the age of 2.5, my father, who was to everybody a hero, he was a fast jet pilot, his cap is on the wall behind. He
Oh.
died saving the lives of 2 other pilots. The pilot whose plane he was test flying would have died that day because the plane had a malfunction. The blade came off the turbine. It was badly manufactured by the makers of it. And these days I would be suing them, but of course you don't in those days. You just accept that the plane had a fault. It caused the fire. My father got the co-pilot out, Commander Bill White. He lived. It was the second time he'd been ejected. But he died because it misfired like goose in Top Gun and sent him into the tailpiece. And he was in Singapore. He was killed near Changi, and his
Oh.
body was washed up 2 days later. They couldn't find it for a couple of days. I don't know what happened. It went into the
Oh,
sea, and then it
wow.
came up a couple of days, washed up on a beach. But I didn't have a father, whereas all my friends around me had dads, and they were complaining about their dad, this or that. And I thought, what's a dad? Like I didn't really know what it was like to have a father. And then in school and things, I remember a teacher, I must have been very young, probably about the age of 7 or something. My teacher was exasperated with me because I couldn't spell. My spelling was awful. And I couldn't do my maths. And she said, look, you're going to have to try harder because otherwise you're going to be a dustman. You're going to be collecting refuge. And you're just going to be nothing in your life. You're going to be nothing. And this was a teacher saying this to me. Now, she didn't know, and I didn't know I was dyslexic and had a thing called dyscalculia, which is a problem with mental maths and numbers. But for years, and certainly well into my 30s, probably into my 40s, I'm now 62, I felt inadequate. I was thick. And even when people would say to me, "Oh, Jonathan, you're really, yeah, that's a very smart comment to make. You're very clever, aren't you?" I go, no, I'm thick. This is my label. I am thick. And so I would just study so much harder than everybody else. I would spend hours. And I remember, my final years before, when people would go to university, but I didn't go because I thought I was thick, so I didn't go to university. But I would spend so much time. I was at a boarding school called Welbeck College, and there was an underground corridors, and I go into this dark underground corridor, and there was a special room which had a few cabins in. I'd just be on my own, studying away, trying to get this stuff to go into my head, but it would go in and it'd go straight out again. But then I'd study harder and I'd study harder and harder. And I think that became quite a driving force to compete and try and overcome this inadequacy in me, this lack, this stupidity. So I'd work harder, and also in sporting terms, I went into through my great uncle Hector. My mother had so little money because she was a widow of a naval officer, and we'd been living in a caravan because they got married so young. They weren't allowed a married quarter. They were just given that they had to rent themselves a caravan on the edge of the runway while he was flying. So money was incredibly tight for a 33-year-old woman with three boys, 9, 7, and 2.5. And so there's always this sense that we didn't have enough money. I didn't have a dad. I didn't feel like I was a victim, but I just felt like I was lacking and I wasn't clever enough. But my mother said, don't worry, you're going to be good with people. So at least she believed in me. And she also was convinced that she was going to be Admiral Sir Paul and Lady Perks. That they always said he was going to be an admiral. He was like the brightest, most capable pilot they ever had for many years. He was in their display team and all sorts of things. He just was such a talented guy, but suddenly at 33 killed. So she thought that one of her children would be going into the forces. So Graham tried for the Navy, but was long-haired and wasn't interested. He ended up becoming the president of British Plastic Surgeons, so very successful that way. But I thought I was going to go into the army. I read magazines and books about this, and so tried to strive to compete to become an army officer. But when I went to boarding schools, everybody was good at rugby and they were big and strong. And I was quite scrawny and thin. So I was scrawny, small. Well, I wasn't small. I'm sort of 5'11", but I was scrawny, but I wasn't very clever. So I wasn't in all the cricket team or the rugby team. I fumbled balls and dropped them and things. So I just thought, and when you're in the teams and they pick the team, I'll have him in my team. I'll have him in my team. I'll have him in my team. When you play these games as kids, no one picked me for their team. So I just thought, I'm just like the one left at the end that no one wants. Come on, John, you come in my team. But then suddenly, around about the age of 18, it all began to come together. And then I joined the army, became an army officer, and it was the making of me. But I've still had to overcome that sense that I wasn't quite smart enough. So I would go on so many courses to get qualified. I'd have more scout badges than any other scout when I was in the scouts, the fire making badge and all this kind of first aider badge. And I went and did my MA and my MBA, and then I became a visiting professor at a business school. And I was trying to prove to this teacher, long dead, that I wasn't thick and I wasn't going to be a dustman. So it's only by doing the Hoffman Institute program, which I told you about and I mentioned on this program, and I interviewed the managing director from that amazing program in the UK. And now I'm going on a Buddhist 11-day Vipassana retreat next week, that I'm much more comfortable with myself and at ease. But for a long time, I would put various masks on. This is how an army officer behaves. Yeah. This is the way you do it. This is how someone coaching a CEO behaves. This is how someone being a managing director of a company behaves. And so I would put on certain masks and certain personas of how I thought I had to behave. And the great joy getting into my 60s now is to rip off these masks and go, do you know what? I can look in the mirror now and I'm happy with who I am now. There may have been times in the past where I've behaved in ways I wasn't proudest of. Now I can do. And I am authentically myself. If you wake me up in the middle of the night and you ask me what's going on, I don't make any lies. I can just tell you the truth. I can be me at work and at home. So that's my story in return.
Wow.
It's longer than I thought. But there you go, Martin. What's your thoughts?
Thanks for sharing that. I mean, these are the moments where I realize, like, it's so easy to get stuck in your own story of, why I am not enough, and then when you hear other people, and this is what happens in the bullshit circle, where you realize actually so many people are actually carrying many other bags as you carry your own bags through life. So thank you for sharing that. Something you said that really stood out, I wanted to ask you about it is, so you said that you somehow didn't have a victim narrative in your mind. Somehow maybe it was normal to be in that state, and maybe it was only in hindsight. Where do you think that comes from, that you did not kind of grab at the victim kind of hat quickly?
Yeah, I think I'm very grateful to my mother. So she had to be both mother and father. And she grew up Quaker grandmother, Agnes, who helped bring me up as well. Grandfather fought in the Honourable Artillery Company in the First World War and got very badly damaged by a German left in a shell hole for 2 days. And so he was always quite suffering from PTSD and not very well. He died quite young. So, and my other grandfather, his airplane ploughed into a hillside in the war while he was an inventor working for the War Office. And so all the crew were killed. He's on the way to see my uncle, whose 21st birthday it was, and he was in the Royal Air Force. And they never made it to the birthday party because they all died in the mist. My other uncle, he died when the blades on the helicopter he was test flying fell off, and he and the inventor of the helicopter both died. So there's been these sort of really quite violent, tragic deaths. And so we just come to terms with it. And I think it was my mother who would go, that we are very grateful for what we have. And I suppose the Christian faith, being appreciative of what we have. She was Church of England by inclination rather than Quaker by upbringing, but to always go and look after other people. So she would do things like on the way from church, we'd slow down by this little old lady who had these 2 carrier bags and this tatty old coat. She stank heavily of urine. She clearly had been sleeping in her clothes and was a bit incontinent. And my mother would go, "Where are you having lunch?" And Margaret, as this lady was called, would go, "Well, I haven't had any lunch." She said, "Well, you're having lunch with us. Get in." And so we'd all move across. As little boys, you'd go,
I love that.
but you think she smells, but my mother's not saying anything about it. So you clearly, it's rude to say something that's unkind. She'd say, "That's unkind. Don't be unkind. Be kind to her. She hasn't got the nice life you've got." Now, we were scraping it together, being lent some money from various members of the family so that we could go to a boarding school, which she couldn't afford it herself. But she'd do things like that, and she'd go and visit little old ladies who were dying in hospices and nursing homes, and she'd take them presents and books and things like that. She'd just do so much. She'd collect litter in the park on the walk with the dog with her wooden walking stick, and she'd collect it and she'd put it in the bins just because that was what you did. And she did. There was a float of vehicles going around in a gala day. I remember sitting on the wall, aged about 7, and this float, this vehicle with on the back of it was a cage with a woman who was a prisoner in rags. And it was Amnesty International, release the prisoners. "Help me," she said, reaching out. And it was my mother. And she never told me she was going to do this. And all my friends went, "That's your mother. What's she doing?" And of course, it was a bit of a shock for a little boy seeing his mother in the bars of a jail. But she believed in that, and she raised money for it. So she had so little, but she was always raising money for people who were even less fortunate than her. So that's a long way of answering your question. Does that make sense?
Moms are so so you and I, it was clear to me when you first met that we had so much to talk through, and our moms are probably yet another thing in common. And I'm so with you. My mom, I remember growing up, every time we would leave the house, she would say, "Do a lot of good today." That was like on repeat. "Do a lot of good today. Do a lot of good today." And for me, the orientation towards others and looking outward, she's a very Catholic person and very religious person. Like that somehow has gotten into the bones, and it's oriented me towards, like, look, no matter what you have, no matter what little you have, you always have something to give. And orient yourself towards that. My mom today, we've been asking her, "Hey, don't you want to retire?" But she is always busy bouncing around doing stuff for others. She runs this nonprofit in the Philippines that trains up women from poorer parts of Manila to then offer primary care and assistance to other women in the neighborhood. And she knocks on my door maybe every 6 months for donations, and I receive it with joy, because I know that this is kind of, not only is this money to be given to them, but this is also a reminder of the heritage I have growing up, that I come from a family that thinks about others constantly.
Yeah, it comes through, it shines through on you. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted you on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. So you meet people for a season, a reason. or a lifetime. And I think you and I have met probably for all three. So let's see how this goes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
all these great experiences, the book, let me just talk a bit about what I've taken from the book so far.
Yeah.
It really is helpful for any of you who out there who are CEOs or who are training CEOs or just startup businesses, entrepreneurs, different businesses. There are some themes that came up. I thought the very interesting one early on in your book, Martin, was the inner circle. And I've seen this in a number of organizations where there's this elite group of the CEO, perhaps the co-founder, maybe HR, maybe the CFO, and they're this close-knit group. The positive side is they're close-knit, they get on well with each other. But for the others, it can be quite exclusive. That they're making a lot of decisions, and I'm a great believer, of course, in cabinet governance, and a smaller group getting on and getting things done quicker. That can work well. But what's I can see the downside of it too as well. What do you see goes wrong with this inner circle?
Many things. When we talk about the inner circle, the trap of the inner circle in the book, we first ask the question: do teams correct each other's errors, or do they amplify it? And when one reviews all the research around team dynamics, the conclusion is so unanimously they tend to amplify each other's errors. And a big part of that are all these really subtle things that happen in the dynamic of the group. Things like there's an anchoring effect that goes on where, when someone with power or with expertise says something, people ever so slightly move towards that point of view. There's these symptoms of groupthink that we talk about in the book. There's when you feel like you're around trusted people who you've kind of gone to maybe literal or figurative war with, there's this feeling of invulnerability. There's this feeling that there is a clear enemy out there, and a lot of these dynamics, which are good in creating this energy and drive to pursue impossible goals, as many startups do, they also can really hurt really quality decision making. There's a really interesting figure in the history of computer science, which we tell about in the book. His name is Bob Taylor. He's a lab manager in this place called Xerox PARC. Not a lot of people know about Xerox PARC, but in the late 70s, early 80s, Xerox PARC is probably the most prolific place for innovation. This is kind of like the Bell Labs of the late 70s, early 80s. GE kind of later on takes on the mantle of this place of innovation, Google at some point and Apple. But in the late 70s, 80s, this is where you get the personal computer. This is where Apple and Microsoft kind of create the paradigm or build the paradigm of the Lisa, which is the first Apple computer. This is where you get all the technologies that then become Pixar, Adobe, 3Com, just prolific place. And he says the following: he says, my job as a leader in this lab is not to resolve conflicts, but it's to make sure I graduate class 1 disagreements to class 2 disagreements. Class 1 disagreements in his mind are what we might call straw man arguments, which is, Jonathan, let me hear your point of view. Let me represent it in the weakest way possible and then refute it. Making it pretty easy to refute. Class 2 disagreements, on the other hand, are, let me represent to you, Jonathan, your point of view in a way that you're satisfied by. You might call this like a strong man argument. And then only then, when you feel satisfied in how I have represented your ideas, let me then come and share my point of view. And he said it was not my role to resolve disagreements. It was my role to make sure that there was enough disagreement and that I graduated every class 1 disagreement to class 2 disagreement.
I like that. I really like that. And your book is full of so many little gems. Let's pick out a few more. One of the things you said in the book is CEOs need to be careful that they don't do so much preparatory work, that they are so committed to that outcome that they're not open to new ideas and innovation and creativity, debate, some contention. And I've seen this and shared you with one organization where the CEO is so well prepared he like knows more, almost more than anybody else. This is about 3 or 4 different CEOs actually. They are the smartest man in the room. The danger with that is that they don't make the room smarter. They just enjoy being the smartest man in the room. And everybody says in the 360 feedback that I receive when I gather 360 feedback on the CEOs, this is, he's the smartest man in the room. But they then defer to them. So they let them make all the decisions because they know best and they're clever. And they do all this preparatory work. Everybody else has prepared their stuff too, but they're so well prepared. They go, no, I don't want to hear about this. Let's cut through to this. So all their preparations just for nothing, really. And one example of an organization is they actually, and I find this incredulous, perhaps people listening go, that's normal, but maybe like, it's like, isn't that those 2 fish swimming along? Was it in Where's Nemo or something? And they're swimming along, and the older fish looks down the 2 little fish, and it says the water's warm today, and they go, what's water? What's he talking about? What's water? So perhaps they think this is just normal. But what this organization does is they write up the minutes of the meeting a few days in advance of the meeting. At all levels. And I go, this is not normal. And they go, no, it's
incredible.
The way our organization. Okay, we'll tweak it a little bit, but we've got it pretty much worked out beforehand. Okay, but guys, what's the point of having the meeting? Because you've already decided what's going on. You've even discussed the pros and cons and things. There's got to be more free flow. Am I missing something, Martin, or is this?
Oh gosh, I mean that's a really good story, Jonathan. And coming back a little bit to this bullshit circle we talked about. I bet that CEO who comes over prepared, and I tell a story in the book as well. She was actually a woman founder, and they're very rare, very few women founders, and that needs to change. But they come therefore with all this baggage of like, look, if if I don't come prepared, I might not be respected or seen as intelligent, or if or if people shoot down the idea or don't think it's any good, that's a reflection on my quality. And I bet that person that you talk about who, is the smart or believes that they're the smartest person in the room, I bet they are overcome with tremendous amounts of insecurity.
In fact, adding to that, Martin, one of the CEOs the other day said to me, he said, actually, I'm probably in some ways better as the COO rather than the CEO because I know so much of everything that's going on in all the different divisions. And I coordinate it and pull it all together. And I go, but that's not your job. That's not why we're paying you all this huge amount of money, because you're actually paid to make 3 decisions a year. You've got to work out what those 3 are.
Yeah.
But really see those through and have somebody else as your COO, because I need you to be elevated up to the strategic level, looking a bit like the Titanic. You're looking, some of the CEOs are down tapping the gauges and shoveling coal into the Titanic's furnace and talking to the crew members, which is important, but not all the time. Whereas the other one is the one who comes to the microphone up on the bridge and he goes, I can see an iceberg 5 miles out, 1 degree to port. Aye, aye, Captain, 1 degree to port. Everything else okay? Yes, carry on. Okay, that's great. I'm just going to do some thinking and some planning. And that's really what you need. You need that.
Yeah, and I deal with this all the time especially with founder CEOs. This idea of the heroic CEO is such a dangerous, aspiration to hold. And what happens in those scenarios is we talk about this in the book, this dynamic of the overperformer underperformer dynamic. What happens there is when you heroically kind of lead your team through all of this and try to fill in every gap and kind of by brute force leadership get people through all of this. What happens there is that you tend to then believe this lie that you are probably the most capable. And then you believe that other people around you are less capable. And then what happens is that people then get trained to rely on you to do that. And then ever so subtly over time, they then realize, well, if I lean back a little bit, nothing's going to happen. Then they start to believe that the role doesn't require them to also contribute to the effort that needs to. So it's a really dangerous, CEO behavior that we need to, that just doesn't contribute to the sustainability of a company.
Yeah. Yeah, so true. And that leads me on to the next theme, which you brought up, which was so good in the book, The Bonfire Moment, which is the importance of a clear chain of command. And when some organizations fudge it and they go for a co-CEO,
Oh.
and or they try and share the equity equally between all the founders. And I had one of my CEOs, and they'd had three of them found it, but then one of them really never contributed anything like as much as the other two, but still had a third of the equity. Years later, when it's doing terribly well and made millions, they've got millions, but they really, their contribution wasn't worth that.
Yeah.
But that's how they split at the beginning. So you gave that warning about just be really careful at the beginning how you divide things up, because you don't know many of them. Well, you're going to tell me in a minute how many fail, but so many of these startups never make it through. But the ones that do, you want to get it right at the beginning, but don't have a co-CEO. You've got to have, just like in generals, I was saying in the military, you'd never have two generals running a battle. It's a recipe for disaster. What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So first of all, there's a lot of research that shows that when you split equity equally in a very static way, you really, you will underperform. And a big part of that is really at the heart of conflict is a feeling of fairness. And when people on the team begin to feel like they are not receiving, or in response, to complement what they're giving to the company, then that begins to break down a lot of the relationships. I think this idea of shared command is really, there are a few examples. You can kind of, a lot of people who justify this setup, they look to these few examples and say, well, it worked for them. You think Stripe, at some point Google kind of had that kind of a setup. Like, look at that, they've succeeded. Like, surely we can succeed. And it's so important to remind people this is the anomaly, not the norm. And you could try to be the anomaly, but I mean, by definition, you're likely not going to succeed. And shared command becomes really tricky, because then you don't have sharing accountability is also just a terrible idea.
Yeah, no, it's really good. And I found that throughout the book, I was taking it going, yeah, I've seen that exactly. So with my many years of mistakes that I've made, or when I've been a managing director and things I've done wrong in a public limited company, and then coaching other leaders, your experience ran so true with what I've experienced as well. And I also loved the element you did on myths. You talked about the danger of the firefighter and the heroics, everybody working crazy hours over the weekend, over the holidays to get this product out on time. And then they do it again, and they do it again and again. And this is like the way of working. The myth of speed, the beware of upward delegation, micromanagement, misallocation of people's time. Do you want to just pick out a couple of your favorite myths that you find? If people are just aware of that, they'd just be very careful.
We talk about, so Bob Sutton is one of my heroes in the space of organizational behavior. He talks about this idea called executive magnification, which is the following. On the days, dear leader, that you are well fed, well rested, not stressed out, you will do and say the right things 9 out of 10 times. Now, that 1 out of 10 times where you are, hungry and stressed out and sleep deprived, and you either say a throwaway comment or say something that you don't truly mean, sometimes that 1 out of 10 times, that becomes the defining moment of your leadership. And executive magnification says that, because you are in a position of power, those random thoughts, those throwaway comments, those pie in the sky ideas of like, we should do this, those get magnified through the organization, and you waste a lot of people's time and effort kind of going for this. This is a really good show called Silicon Valley. It's a parody. It's on HBO. It's a parody of of characters you find in my world here in Silicon Valley. And the one of the main characters, he's rushing off to an important meeting, and he says, the bear is sticky, or something like this. The bear is sticky. And then he gets into the car and he goes off for a few days, and they have this big product launch coming in a couple of days, and everyone's left to think, the bear is sticky. What is it? And they have these meetings of like, okay, let's break down this sentence. The bear is sticky. And then one group says, let's do red teaming. Okay, one group gets a real bear to come on for the product launch. The other person like figures out, and then they come in and they said, we're already, the CEO comes back after a few days and they're about to go on stage to launch this new product. And they're like, we're already with the bear. And it's like, what bear? Like, you said the bear was sticky. He said, yeah, that darn honey bottle that was the shape of a bear was sticky. You should wash it. And then like in the background, like this bear's coming. They're like, oh, hide the bear, like, return the bear. And it's a good moment to show that, leaders, be careful with what you say, like, because you're in power.
Give me the link to that. Oh, that's so good. No, and time and again, I remember another famous global bank, and I went to Portugal, and there's this incredible high-rise building, and I'm on the way to their offices, and the taxi driver said, "Oh, this one was bought by the bank you're going to." I said, "Why do they buy it?" And I don't know, the taxi driver said. I went in there, I said, "Why did you guys buy that strange tower over there?" I said, "Oh yeah, it's been a complete nightmare. The boss came over from New York and he said, 'Oh, I like that tower.' And we went and bought it because he likes that tower." And just like, and then he comes back and he goes, "Well, why are we on that tower?" He goes, "Well, you said we should." "No, I didn't. I just said I liked it." And so, as you say, this is this executive magnification of comments that they made. And it was particularly classic in the military when the general would make some passing comment. "I think these walls should be blue," and it's the wrong color, really. Walks off, and people are busy the next few days painting the walls blue, and the Queen always had, and now the King will always, everything smells of new paint, and the toilets are always new wherever she went. We've got about 5 minutes left, so
okay,
so much more that we could touch on, but just very briefly, in your book, you also give away tips and advice on the workshop and how you run that workshop. So people getting the book, they can get all that material from you, can't they? Is that right, Marshall?
Yes, absolutely. It's all in the book. And the idea was, at some point we were running these workshops around the world. It had reached founders in 70 countries. And when we would come back to some of these countries, these founders would say, "Hey, I hope you don't mind. Like, I took photos of your slides and took your materials, and we ran a bootleg version with other founders. And we thought, we might as well help you do it well. Here are all the actual slides." And that was really the spirit behind this book, that we wanted to just reach as many people.
So lovely. And I keep getting told by people I should monetize my podcasts. And I'd make a fortune from it. But actually, I give this material away, and people can look at all the book reviews on the website thing, because I just believe it's the right thing to do. It's my bit of giving back. And I loved that about you and the way you did it. So thank you for what you've done. There's so many things we could have covered, but let's go down to just, I always interested in a leader's tip on when your clients have got teams that have gone toxic, or individuals who are toxic in their team. What have you found as a tip to deal with teams that are toxic? How have they turned them around? What's worked? If you had a simple 3-step process or something you've seen work well.
So the way I like to ask that question is, what is the core mechanism? Like, how do you help smart, motivated people to develop and to change and to grow? Because many times these toxic environments have, ambitious teams trying to run after impossible goals. And, I think it's underappreciated because it's so common in our in corporate life. But I think like having high quality feedback is almost by far the core mechanism of change. You almost want to create for yourself as a leader, or as people who are helping leaders, you need to create you need to engineer these crises for them, because crisis is what leads to change. And feedback becomes a really quality feedback, I should say, becomes a really good vehicle to create those small crises so that people then are propelled to change. You can almost stop there. You can almost just make sure that the feedback is high quality, and a smart, motivated person will kind of figure it out themselves, and you don't need to even be there for that. So I see that. In fact, I have a photo kind of at the back of my desk here of surgery back in the 1800s. I'll be quick here. I know we don't have a lot of time, but in this photo, you'll see surgeons in their outside garments, In that time, they would pick up a bandage from the floor and if it falls and just reuse it. They'll put the needle that they suture someone up on their lapel. And then they wondered why the survival rate of these surgeries was incredibly low. In fact, you had to prepay for your surgery before you go into surgery because chances are you won't make it through. It was only after a few years that then Pascal discovered the germ theory. And then suddenly, as they apply all these lessons, then the success rate increases. For me, the value of feedback, it puts into question what your theory of success is as a leader. The theory of success of those 1800s surgeons were like, we just need to get more sophisticated in the ways we run surgery. And then here comes this scientist who wasn't even a surgeon and says, actually, your theory of success is wrong. It's dead wrong. It's because there are germs that are microscopic. And my hope with leaders and my work with leaders is oftentimes asking themselves, what is the germ theory in your world that you have maybe grossly missed?
I love that. What's the germ theory in your world? It's so true. With a brother who's a surgeon, he did tell me that story, and it was just shocking. Penultimate question: your favorite books, and you've got a couple. So
Yeah.
share both and why you liked them, Martin.
So Ryan Holiday's Ego is the Enemy is maybe the book I've listened to and read maybe every year or maybe every 2 years in my past 15, ever since it was published, really. It talks about stoicism and, really the countercultural belief that, this, this life isn't about you, and it's about your contribution to the world. And, soon after you die, no one's going to remember you. And so, like, how do you want to live your life if you believe that at the core? The other one is
with that for a minute, because Stoicism is one of my favorite philosophies. Along with, actually, I'm finding that the Buddhist approach so very interesting. This idea of impermanence, and that actually suffering, and that it's our aversion and our craving that is part of the problem. If we can be more non-attached to what goes on, and also be all of us is better than just one of us. This Philippines kind of upbringing of the culture and the community, what your mum's doing for other people to go out and do good, rather than the British American approach, which is, I'm just going to fight for myself, and I'm just going to look after me and succeed and work all hours, and the cult of the individual. And I think bringing those two together, which you've done through this cultural blend that you've got, I think is very powerful. So love the Ego is the Enemy. And the second one?
So David Brooks, The Road to Character. And first of all, he's just a fantastic writer. But in that book, it's a good reminder that ultimately it's character that matters. And how do you somehow in society we've gotten the order wrong. We've thought of, what do I want to have, therefore what do I do to get that, which then somehow shapes the way I am. And he says, instead, think of who you want to be, and then let that inform you what you want to do, and then only then let that impact what you then have. And so I think putting it in that order has been just a very grounding way to live, is what I found.
I so love that. Who you want to be, one, then what you want to do, two, and then three, it's what you'll get.
Yeah.
So good. Hey, you're just full of little gems, wee gems, full of wee spuds, as my Irish mother. Okay, let's do the final part, which is a lovely one. And would you be kind enough to introduce yourself? Just give a little nutshell of the jobs you've done, and things you've done, and the book you've just written, and then give us your top 2-minute tip.
Great. So my name is Martin Gonzalez, and I think of my career in 3 platforms. The first one is I am a principal of org and leadership development at Google. And in my work there, I support very closely our AI research and engineering leaders in all matters, org structure, culture, leadership. And I've had a tremendous tenure career kind of doing work really with innovators that are pushing what's possible in this world through technology. That's the first one. The second one is I do a lot of work with startups outside of Google, under the conviction that startups are the lifeblood of any economy. They create the net new jobs in any economy. And the best moment to shape the way these places are built and are led, and the cultures that they build, the best time is really at the beginning. And so I spend a lot of my time through Google for Startups to do that, to do research also on entrepreneurship. And I've had wonderful collaborations with Wharton, and then which has led then to this book that we published very recently in May, called The Bonfire Moment. The third part of my portfolio career is that I teach, and I've loved teaching in places like Stanford, which is my primary affiliation, but also spent a lot of time in Wharton and in INSEAD, which is a European school, and many other schools. And I teach a lot around culture, organization development, org behavior, people analytics. And as I share, I come from a line of teachers, and so this is a big part of who I am. And I joke my wife that I want to be wheeled out in a coffin teaching. That's how I want to die. My top tip, I've learned through my life that we all in varying degrees have some form of privilege, some more than others, but everyone has some source of privilege. And I think it's so important for leaders around the world to remember that you should lift as you climb, and that your privilege, while it's been gifted to you, you need to use it as a torch to light the path of others. And I think that's the way that you can contribute to this world, and that we build the world that we want our children and our children's children to live in.
Wow. I just so love that. Martin Gonzalez, it's been a real pleasure having you as my guest on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. I know people around the world will take a lot of useful information from you. I know I have. Good luck with all the work that you do in Google. And
Thank you, Jonathan.
I do encourage people. It's a great book to listen to. As a dyslexic, I've listened to it, but I'm sure also it's a great one to read and to tap into all that you've given away, and that generosity is very special. So thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you, John. The honor is mine, and I've loved this conversation. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.